SB Keshav Swami, Svayam Bhagavan Keshava Swami, previously known to many of us as Sutapa. He's an author, a mentor in the community. He's a very dynamic teacher. He's traveling. He's always been traveling, but he's traveling even more now. He took sannyas recently. I remember him back in 2002. He was going to UCL, University College London, and he did his degree in information management. Then he was coming to the programs, and then he got more and more interested, and he actually became a full-time monk at the Bhagavan Manor in London. And over the years, he's just got stronger and stronger. It's really interesting. He's very studious. He loves to write. And he's pioneered a lot of programs like the School of Bhakti at the Bhagavan Manor, which was very much about training and education. And he was looking after the new student monks there as well and helping them to learn about spiritual life. And he has a particularly thoughtful way of presenting Krishna consciousness, which I really appreciate. He's authored many books, many books. I won't list them all, but I do encourage you to go and check them out. 2022, so last year, he accepted a lifetime vow of renunciation as a sannyasi, hence the new name Keshava Swami. And he's traveling, speaking to universities, corporates, government organizations, spiritual communities, and really bringing wisdom to these places and trying to, I guess, inject this spiritual wisdom into the world at large. So I'm going to hand over to Maharaj now, give him a hearty welcome. I appreciate you being here. I know you've been just doing a retreat and it's late, so really grateful you're here and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Thank you to everyone for joining and those who may join after and see the recording. Thank you for organizing this opportunity. It's really, I think, an important discussion. And the topic, when Ravi shared it with me, which we had spoken about before, was something we both felt very inspired to explore, humanity, finding humanity in transcendence. As one English writer, I think, says, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience, but still those human identities and spiritual identities, how to balance them. So we'll kind of look at a little bit of that today. As Ravi said, what we'll try and do is I'll share with some slides, maybe some thoughts for about 20-25 minutes. We invite any of you to share your thoughts, your questions, your comments, reflections, and hopefully we'll all go away with a bit more of a deeper understanding and then a nourished spirit after this session. I'll just begin with some prayers and then we'll kind of move forward from there. Om Gyanatimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshthaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Today we're talking about humanity and transcendence, and one of the things we'll be talking about is individuality and how everyone is on an individual journey, though on a universal path. And although we're on individual journeys, sometimes we do observe trends. And one of the trends of spiritual life is often that we begin with a very philosophical understanding of spiritual life or Krishna consciousness. It doesn't take long before you are invested with the knowledge that the body is temporary, that the mind is also just a covering, but that you're the spirit soul that goes beyond the body and mind. And that's something that we're taught very, very early on in spiritual life. In fact, when Krishna is training and coaching and nurturing Arjuna into a higher understanding, then this is one of the first things, as we know, that Krishna shares with Arjuna. We understand that we're spiritual beings and that the body and the mind are basically coverings. And sometimes what can happen in the trajectory of spiritual life is we begin with that kind of understanding. And what can often happen is that we then conclude that the body, the mind, and everything associated with those external coverings is therefore unimportant, unnecessary, is transitory, is temporary, is illusory, and therefore doesn't require that much attention and isn't really that useful at all. And then what generally happens is through the trajectory of spiritual life, we begin to realize that, yes, but I'm situated in the body, I'm situated with this mind, and I'm not transcendental to them. And not just that, we begin to realize that the body and mind are actually a means through which we can explore our spirituality and find connection. It's very, very interesting. In the Bhagavatam, we find two different words for the material body. In the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam, the material body is described as klesha da. Da means to give, and klesha means misery. So the material body is basically described as that which gives you misery. But it's very, very interesting in the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam, when Prahlad is speaking, then he designates the material body as arthada, or literally that which gives you the greatest benefit. So here within the Bhagavatam is very interesting. We have two words for the body which seem to be completely opposite, but are both completely true, because the body can be the giver of misery and the body can be the giver of great benefit if utilized and channeled in the appropriate way. And so today's talk about humanity and transcendence really is about looking at that. I'm going to share some slides as we kind of go through this journey a little bit. And the idea is, what we want to do is basically look at how embracing our humanity in the spiritual journey will not only nourish our own spiritual journeys, but will make for very, very powerful spiritual communities, which will then nurture generations of individuals who are looking to find transcendence. Humanity doesn't need to be neglected in transcendence. And humanity, on the contrary, can be utilized in a very, very beautiful way to achieve transcendence. And if we're able to do this, it will create a much more natural journey for the individual and a much more powerful and nourishing experience for those who are trying to elevate themselves in this journey. In talking about humanity and transcendence today, I'm basically going to look at it through three lenses. When I talk about humanity in transcendence, I'm going to first take it from the point of view of morality. That what role does the morality of the human being play in the spirituality of their ultimate quest? Are morals important? Are ethics valuable? Is that aspect of humanity even necessary for one on the spiritual journey? Morality is so much part of human society. So we're going to look at that. The second aspect of humanity that I'm going to look at is individuality. Because we are individuals, we look different. We don't just look different, we think different. and we don't just think different. Internally, we're invested with different abilities, different attitudes, different character traits. What role do those individual variances which we have play in our spiritual journey? Are they to be neglected? Are they to be utilized? What are the boundaries of that? We'll kind of maybe explore a little bit of that aspect of humanity. And the third aspect of humanity that I want to talk about, I've designated as relatability, if I can spell that, relatability. Apologies if I spelled that wrong. Yes, how do we relate to each other as human beings? How do we relate within our communities to each other? What kind of character, what kind of exchange, what kind of human love do we express between each other? How do we relate to the world around us? I thought that's a really, really interesting lens to explore humanity and transcendence as well, because this is something we do every single day. And so I'll just try to share some thoughts on this about 3 ways to find, nourish, and ultimately utilize our humanity in transcendence. 1, through morality, 2, through individuality, and 3, through increasing relatability in our different interactions with people. I'll begin today with morality. Morality is very, very interesting, because when we come to spiritual life and we take up this spiritual quest, then we understand the spiritual principles that we're seeking in our life, the spiritual principles that we hold as our North Star, trump everything else. There's no higher principle in this world than the spiritual principle. In fact, even in Shastra, we say that Smartavya satatam Vishnur Vishmartavya najato chit sarve vidhi nisheda shur etayoreva kinkara. That always remember Krishna, never forget him. Every other rule and regulation, every other principle outlined is subservient to this. And therefore, sometimes in that understanding, if it's not complete, it can end up leading one to believe that the lower, seemingly lower human principles of life are not really that important. Now you're doing the higher spiritual principles. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he explores this very, very beautifully in one of his writings, and he identifies 4 categories within ethics and morality. He says 1 category within ethics and morality are basically what he calls the immoral materialists. And he basically says they are the people who have no spiritual vision of life, they have no higher goal, and they also don't believe in following any sense of morality. It's almost just like eat, drink, be merry, enjoy, and just go for it. No boundaries almost. Then Bhaktivinoda Thakur says you also then have the non-theistic moralists. And he says those are the people who also don't necessarily have a spiritual vision of life, but they are a little more refined. They're a little bit more cultured and civilized. They realize that, yeah, although there's no ultimate goal of life, we got to live together now. And because we got to live together now, we got to cooperate. We got to have some boundaries. We got to relate to each other in an appropriate way, but ultimately with the goal of maximizing everyone's sense gratification. And therefore, the goal is still sense gratification, and the morality they see helps the sense gratification because it creates more organization, more equality, and protects us from, diverting away or doing things that may restrict our enjoyment. Bhaktivinoda Thakur then says there are the moral theists. He says these are those who believe in God, but what they do, and they're moral, but what they actually do is they place more emphasis on morality than theism. In other words, they believe in God, but their main priority, more than spiritual connection, is on sub-religious principles, ethics, morals, living in a good way, appropriate conduct. And yes, God is in the picture, but the most important thing is to be a good person. The kind of people who say we serve God by serving humanity. So he says this is another category, the moral theists, who believe in God but subordinate it and place morality higher. And then Bhaktivinoda Thakur says the pretenders. He says those who are claiming to believe in God and claiming to follow a spiritual path but follow no morality and neglect appropriate conduct with others. And it's very interesting that Bhaktivinoda Thakur gives this analysis, because basically what he's saying is that none of these are actually perfect. Clearly, those with a material view of life, whether they follow morality or not, their morality is ultimately for sense gratification, even if it is there. So he says that's out of the picture. Clearly, the pretenders, that doesn't work in terms of advancing our spirituality, because they cause harm. But then he also says that subordinating your spirituality to morality is also going off the scale on the other side. And so how do devotees deal with morality, and how do they incorporate morality? I think Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur summarizes it nicely here. He says, we do not confine our conception only to worldly morality. Our ambition is to attain the morality of transcendental love of God, which is the ultimate goal of everyone's life and which is beyond all forms of ordinary and extraordinary morality. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is saying, we want to attain transcendental love of Godhead. That's the ultimate morality. He says, when a pure soul is situated on the transcendental platform of love of Godhead, worldly morality appears insignificant. Now remember, he says, when a pure soul is situated on the transcendental platform, then worldly morality appears insignificant. But then he says, at the same time, devotees are neither opposed nor attached to worldly morality. Rather, all forms of morality stand in attendance on spiritual morality. This is very, very important. Just as a maidservant becomes glorious by serving an exalted personality. Our acharyas are basically teaching that worldly morality is definitely subordinate to spiritual realization. In spirit, the ultimate aspiration of a devotee is to do what Krishna deems to be right, because Krishna is all good, and whatever Krishna deems to be right is the ultimate morality. However, in pursuance of that ultimate spiritual morality, which requires a high level of spiritual consciousness and a high level of spiritual connection, what our acharyas basically teach is that practicing worldly morality in such a way that it actually nourishes one's spiritual consciousness and spiritual journey is actually very, very much required and very, very much encouraged. We constantly find in the Srimad Bhagavatam a kind of tension between dharma, I won't say tension, or balancing between dharma and bhakti. Because we understand that the following of dharma is ultimately meant to lead one to bhakti. Bhakti is ultimately placed on the highest level. However, we're constantly seeing that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's associates are honoring worldly morality. They're honoring principles of society. They're honoring various codes and conducts of dharma, knowing that preserving those principles will allow one to create a fertile place in their consciousness, character, and heart for spirituality to appear. And therefore, perhaps one thing we can think about first and foremost in our own life, and then in our communities, is how are we actually promoting morality in such a way and ethics in such a way that they will create for better character, greater sensitivity, and basically a more fertile consciousness from which genuine spiritual realization can come about. Because often what happens is we go to one extreme or the other. Either we neglect morality, thinking it to be unimportant and worldly and something on the material platform, or what we do is we embrace morality without understanding that the ultimate morality is to follow Krishna's guidance as the all good. And therefore we place morality higher than divinity. So to avoid both of those extremes, but perhaps in our lives, one way in which we can start to embrace humanity and transcendence is by promoting and encouraging and imbibing a greater moral and ethical framework within our own lives and our communities, so that we can actually pursue spiritual transcendence in a more powerful way. So this is the first kind of point I want to kind of put out there for everyone's consideration, that morality is a very, very important thing within transcendence and spirituality. The second area I want to go to is individuality. One of the main concerns that people often have when they come to a religious movement is loss of individuality. They feel they will have to dress the same way, have the same ideology, follow the same lifestyle, be situated between all of these rules and regulations. And often people feel it becomes a limitation on the expression of their individuality. The interesting thing is, if we study the Bhagavad Gita, then Krishna actually, there are two verses in the Bhagavad Gita which Krishna repeats basically verbatim twice. And the first verse of those, probably many of you know, is the famous instruction where Krishna tells Arjuna, always think of me, engage your mind in me, become my devotee, and dedicate yourself fully to me. Krishna says in the 9th and the 18th chapter, verbatim, repeated verse. But there's one other verse in the Bhagavad Gita which Krishna repeats twice. And it's very, very interesting what that other verse is. This is the verse that's repeated twice. If you see here in the third chapter and the 18th chapter, Krishna says basically the same thing twice. Shreyan Swadharma Viguna. It is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than another's duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duty, for to follow another's path, Krishna says, is dangerous. So this is very, very interesting, because people tend to think that spirituality restricts one's individuality. But the idea actually is that spiritual life, when appropriately practiced and in communities where it's being appropriately nurtured, individuality should actually be encouraged more and more. In the world, people think they're expressing individuality, but what's basically happening is that they are being bombarded by opinions, expectations, pressures, social trends. And in the pursuance of conformity to all of those things, they're not able to hear their own heart, hear their own voice, hear their own calling. And therefore people, although feeling in the material world that they're expressing their individuality, are actually being restricted in their individuality, overpowered by all this other noise. And the idea is that when we come to spiritual life, all of those voices of expectation, opinions, pressures, trends, all of those things should actually become somewhat subdued, and the devotee should find a space for them to for themselves to find their own calling. But the difficulty is that sometimes someone may leave the material world, come into a spiritual community, and they find themselves in that spiritual community being bombarded by another set of opinions, expectations, pressures, social traditions within a spiritual community. And therefore, the same thing then happens to them, and they're not able to express their individuality. So I would suggest that in our own life and in our communities, the second way in which we can embrace humanity and transcendence is by encouraging individuality, by encouraging authenticity, by encouraging each of us, all of us, in the different roles that we play, to play them in a way which is very, very true to ourselves and in a very, very natural way. I was sharing with Ravi that he was asking me, how did you feel, taking this step into the renounced order? And I said, one of the main considerations and points on my mind when entering this change of ashram was how I would be able to maintain my authenticity in that role. And I think that's really, really important. And oftentimes people are, blocked from finding their individuality because there are many stereotypes, either self-imposed or imposed within the community. And so generally, we repress our individuality because of past beliefs, because of fears of what other people will say, or fears of failure, ego, opinions, and expectations. So oftentimes our individuality becomes repressed because of all of these things, and individuality can never, even Krishna says to Arjuna, what will repression accomplish? We have to be able to express ourselves. We have to be able to be authentic, be genuine, because any other life just isn't sustainable, and any other life won't bring us to our greatest contribution. And so the second aspect I would suggest we look at when we talk about finding humanity and transcendence is how can we in our individual lives and in our communities allow expression of individuality within boundaries where it won't cause any spiritual danger, but rather create spiritual opportunity and growth for everyone. And we see this, that, the acharyas are all completely Krishna conscious, but very, very individual. There's a famous story that Gaur Kishore Das Babaji, once he was instructing Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, we know they were very, very different in their individual personalities. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said, my spiritual master gave me 3 instructions. Number 1, never make any disciples. Number 2, never associate with materialistic people. And number 3, never go to Calcutta. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he said, I followed him perfectly. And it was an interesting point. And then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur qualified himself. He said, because I never made any disciples, I saw all of my disciples as my spiritual teachers. He said, I never associated with materialistic people because whenever I was in the midst of others, rather than taking association, I was trying to share my association or share the association of my predecessors. And he said, when I traveled to Calcutta, I was never actually in Calcutta because I always stayed in the association of the devotees. And therefore, I was not living in Calcutta. I was living in a transcendental, sacred space. And so this is very, very interesting because he was completely aligned with his spiritual teacher. He understood the essence of what his spiritual teacher was telling him when he gave those instructions. But what he was then doing is living it in his own individual, authentic way. He was not trying to be a copy of his spiritual master, but was embracing his own role, his own individual, unique contribution, while being completely aligned with his spiritual teacher. And so I would suggest that we really deeply think, how can we all find our own individuality and create atmosphere where individuality and authenticity really flourishes. And the final thing I'd like to talk about today in terms of humanity and transcendence is relatability. This is the very first verse of the Sad Goswami Ashtakam, talking about the 6 Goswamis. The 6 Goswamis, as we know, were the epitomes of Krishna Bhakti. We know that in the spiritual world, they are manjaris, they are the closest confidential servants of Sri Sri Radha and Krishna, the divine couple. But what is very, very incredible is that the 6 Goswamis, in their transcendence, in their complete elevation of consciousness, they were able to live in this world and simultaneously be so relatable, so accessible, so much able to connect with people on the human level. It's often said that the Goswamis of Vrindavan, in Bhakti Ratnakara is explained, they would walk around Govardhan and they would go into the villages. And when the villagers saw that they had come, everyone would come running, and the children, and they would ask the families, like, and how is this person doing? And how is that person doing? Did your daughter get married? How is your father's health? It said that if there was ever a conflict in any of the villages, then the Goswamis would be called to mediate the conflict, because everyone just had so much love and trust in them. So what we're getting here is a picture of the Goswamis who were incredibly rooted in transcendence, but simultaneously had spotless character, and who were so relatable and inspiring because of their human character. We often hear about Srila Prabhupada and how he went to stay in Butler, Pennsylvania, and Sally Agarwal, who he was staying with, who didn't particularly have a deep spiritual kind of inclination in one sense, she almost fell in love, she did fall in love with Srila Prabhupada. She said because his character was just so beautiful, his qualities were so heart-touching. She said when he smiled, his smile was oceanic. And it's explained that even their son, Bridge, he referred to Srila Prabhupada as Swami Jesus. In other words, Srila Prabhupada, without necessarily speaking to them through philosophy, his human touch, his human kindness was touching them on a deep level. So here, when glorifying the 6 Goswamis, Srinivas Acharya says, I offer my respectful obeisances to the 6 Goswamis, namely Sri Rupa Goswami, Sanatan Goswami, Sri Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, Sri Raghunath Das Goswami, Sri Jiva Goswami, and Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami, who are always engaged in chanting the holy name of Krishna and dancing. In other words, always rooted in transcendence. They are just like an ocean of love of Godhead. And they are popular with both the gentle and ruffians alike, because they are not envious of anyone. Whatever they do, they are all pleasing to everyone, and they are fully blessed by Lord Chaitanya. Thus, they are engaged in missionary activities meant to deliver all the conditioned souls in the material universe. So here we're seeing that character, our own character, is such an important part of spiritual life. Our good character, our good qualities. Sometimes what can happen in Krishna consciousness is we feel that because we are practicing a very high process, a high spiritual sadhana, that our character and these other things don't matter anymore. Some people think character is not important. Some people think their character is already good and they don't need to work on it. Some people think their character can't change. Some people think their character will automatically change. And some people think their character is too painful to change. For different reasons, there can be blocks that we come across in terms of developing our own character and relatability. And what I would suggest today is that embracing the human side in our relatability within the movement, being more kind to our Vaishnava brothers and sisters, being more human in our interactions, and also our connection with the outside world with whom we're trying to share Krishna consciousness. The more we show our teachings through our own character and our own relatability, the more we are representations of living theology, that people look at us and can relate to us, not just because of a high philosophy that we're practicing, but because of a beautiful character that's come about. That will also be a very, very important part in our desire and aspiration for transcendence. And so these are some thoughts that I wanted to share with everyone about humanity and transcendence, that rather than neglecting humanity and trying to artificially embrace transcendence, which I think subconsciously we can often do, let us look at humanity. And today we looked at 3 lenses. Number 1, morality. How can we embrace proper moral and ethical conduct in our own lives and our own communities in order to be more empowered to achieve transcendence? Number 2, how can we embrace individuality? How can we inside of ourselves have the strength to be ourselves, to be authentic, to be genuine in such a way that it supports our Krishna consciousness because we're honoring our dharma, our psychophysical nature? And how can we create communities where there is not all these opinions and expectations and traditions which maybe block people from finding their individuality? And the third aspect of humanity is, how can we be more relatable? How can we have better relationships because of our human kindness, because of our character, our qualities? How can we do that within our movement? And how can we show to the world through our character that Krishna consciousness makes us better people, and Krishna consciousness empowers us to have relationships in the most beautiful way? I would suggest that these 3 aspects of humanity can very much support our endeavors for transcendence. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Share some words, and happy to have some discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maharaj. Really, really interesting. I have a couple of things I'm going to just ask Maharaj, but please, the devotees who are in here in Zoom, if you've got any questions, either put them in the chat or press the raise hand button, and we'll ask you to ask your question. Maharaj, I thought you thought about that really well, especially in terms of how those 3 aspects of humanity can support transcendence. I just wonder as well, though, so it's maybe a bit more broadly around humanity in general for devotees. So for those of us who maybe, take it up completely and spend some time in a temple, a lot of the things that we might have associated with our humanity, we oftentimes might give them up. So like things like our family, our friends, maybe pets, interests, sports, gardening, hobbies, whatever, different things that sort of are normally related to us human things. And then I think it's changing, but I think there was a time where those things were sort of just seen as very mundane and very meaningless. So I just wonder what your thoughts are. Obviously nowadays some devotees have dogs or pets, and even, of course, there's some characters in the Chaitanya Charitamrita who have dogs and stuff, and maybe even other pets. So yeah, just be interested to hear your thoughts. I know Sitapati has a question which we'll come to in a moment, but if you could just share some thoughts on that. Like, does it have to detract? So what you said are brilliant things to lift up transcendence, but do other quirks of humanity necessarily detract from transcendence just because they're human, if you like?
Yeah, it seems so a few thoughts come to mind, and I'll just share them, and then we can kind of see. I often think of, if you buy an apple from a market and you want to offer it to Krishna, we can think of the apple as our life. Then what happens is, before you offer it to Krishna, you'll see that there are certain parts of the apple which just kind of need to be cut off because they're just unofferable. Things that clearly are not going to support your journey in any way, and are rather going to detract. So we know in Krishna consciousness, there are certain boundaries, certain things that, are just clearly outlined as, detrimental. But then we see that there are other parts of the apple that if you just put it under a tap and you kind of cleanse it and you then they're not such a problem. So it seems that there are things which are completely out of the realm, and it seems that there are other things which can be redirected and utilized appropriately. And it seems that when one matures in their spiritual understanding, then they become more and more equipped to be able to engage more things in such a way that it won't be detrimental. But you're right, in the beginning, therefore, what we try to do is maybe take a step away from it, become established, and then maybe we become more empowered to come back and then.
That's a really valid point, actually. It depends on where you're at in the journey. That's a good point.
Yeah. And just one other thing which comes to mind on this, in the Bhagavad Gita, you basically find three kind of darshans of the world. You find the karma darshan, which is that let's try and enjoy the world. And then you kind of get this jnana darshan, which is like escape the world. And then you kind of get this bhakti darshan, which is like engage with the world. And it seems that they're not just three separate darshans, but it almost seems in the life of a devotee, you basically go through that. You're trying to enjoy the world, and then it doesn't work. The thesis doesn't work. So then it's like the antithesis, like just reject the world, eject yourself, distance. And then it's like the synthesis, which is like, okay, how do we now come back and appropriately deal with this? So I would suggest that everyone, again, we're talking about humanity and transcendence. So everyone's an individual and does it in different ways. But I think as we mature and we become spiritually deeper, we become more equipped. Therefore, you see someone like Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who could do all kinds of incredible things in terms of yukta vairagya that others would hesitate to do, but that was possible because of his deep spiritual realization.
Yeah, definitely. So Sitapati has a question. What's the definition of morality? But he's raised his hand, so I'm going to invite him to. He's just come on there. I'm going to. Yeah. Hi, Sitapati. How are you doing? Would you like to ask a question?
Krishna.
Yeah,
I would. Hare Krishna. Prabhu hosting. Great to see you again. And Maharaj, my dandavats to both of you. So my question is around morality. At the beginning, you from Amrita Vani, you contrasted or placed together morality and transcendental morality, spoke about the importance of morality. I may have missed it, but I don't know if you actually defined what is morality.
Yeah. I guess in this context, when we talk about morality, we're talking about, I guess, when we're talking about spiritual morality, the type of behaviors, mindsets, values, and attitudes that will culture an appropriate consciousness from which spirituality and Krishna consciousness can grow. So basically, my understanding of morality in this context is talking about, the behaviors, the kind of the attitudes, and just the principles by which we make decisions, all of these things, which we use to navigate our journey in this world. The morality is what are those things that you've accepted on that journey that will then help you towards your goal?
Buddy, did you have another? Did you raise your hand again? I think.
I do. Yeah. If I could ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
I'd like to throw a curveball one to Maharaj to see how you hit it out of the park. So yeah, while I was listening, I just kind of Googled it. One definition of morality is the set of standards that enable people to live cooperatively in groups. It's what societies determine to be right and acceptable. And of course, as devotees, we kind of live in two societies simultaneously. We live in the society of the devotees, the Vaishnava society, and then we live in this other society. And they often have two moralities which can sometimes conflict with each other. And I mean, one example, very recent, kind of controversial, was the whole thing about like taking a vaccination for the good of the society, cooperatively live in a group. It was a big push for the outside society. But then some devotees were like, well, I researched it. It contains fetal bovine serum from cows, and that's against my personal, as a Vaishnava. And so now those two things are placed in very stark opposition to each other. And, you had like a line almost come down through the middle of the Vaishnava society on the whole thing, with some people being like, we have to do it. It's for the good of society, for other people. And then some people are like, it's against my religious principles. It's against our religious principles. And it was almost like one of the things you were saying, and I heard it in there with the Sad Goswami, the Vaishnava Achar. That's another kind of aspect of it. And so we had all these things happening at once, the outside society, the regulative principles, the Vaishnava Achar between devotees, and it was like a washing machine. And I just wanted to throw that to you to see how you would resolve those things with the principles that you've been laying out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think, we are some level of adjustment, some level of, because we're interfacing, as you're saying, two different worlds, there's always going to be some level of individual variation in how those two things come about. Some will hold more heavily on the kind of not compromising kind of our spiritual principles for the world, and some will be more adaptive. Some on certain issues will be more adaptive, and on certain situations will be more kind of, no, let's stick to our principles. Basically, with any question like this, I think we're always going to find a level of individuality in the conclusion that we come to in terms of what we're meant to do in any given situation. You mentioned one thing, which is like the effect of that, which is then the achar and the relationships and I think that may be the key point more than anything, is not that there's difference of opinion, because I think difference of opinion is healthy, and difference of opinion is ultimately required to arrive at the kind of optimum perception in any situation. But I think the main thing is how we arrive there, how we navigate those differences of opinions, the ways in which Vaishnavas interface and kind of debate those issues, the forums that we create so that there can be healthy dialogue. Maybe what we often experience is because we haven't created enough healthy forums and boundaries and opportunities for that discussion to go on progressively. What then happens is that the differences of opinion then lead to a breakdown and almost a disunity and a kind of Cold War and that kind of stuff, So I think we're not gonna the second aspect of humanity and transcendence was individuality, and therefore humanity means we all have an individual approach to understanding any given issue. But I think, how do we manage individuality, create unity in diversity, and create forums where there can be appropriate exchange of ideas so that every disagreement doesn't have to descend into an argument, which then creates split. That is going to be the challenge, it seems to me, in these situations.
Yeah, really nice point, actually. And I know it's very different from the particular example that Sutapati gave, but I was just thinking about that, when we talk about having different sets of morality potentially. So, sometimes we may, I've heard it in the past, and I'm sure many devotees may have, that there's a sort of a sense of morality which is, well, we can steal those flowers because anyway, Krishna owns them, really, so we can just take them. Or we, let's say it was a long time ago, but there was a petrol strike, and there was massive queues of cars queuing up for the petrol. But because the devotees are going out to do Harinam or book distribution, wherever, they think they can just completely skip the entire queue and go in. Or you get a parking ticket, and we don't have to pay these things because we're on the mission from God, or whatever it is. So it's kind of like, I think it's a dangerous territory, a bit of a dangerous territory personally, when you go into kind of having, like we have our own morality, which is sort of different from the world that we live in. I mean, certain things like principles and stuff, of course, but I just think it can be a bit of a dangerous territory personally. I wondered what you thought.
Yeah, and Srila Prabhupada talked about this. He talked about the concept of loka vichar, that the devotee should always be conscious of the public opinion. And I think if you would do a search on Veda-based, Srila Prabhupada does talk about that often. And therefore, because we're not just that we're living in a society, but that we have a purpose in this society, which is to try to share Krishna consciousness powerfully and dynamically, there's a sense in which if we become too divorced of public opinion, then we can be just seen as irrelevant, and it may build barriers between us and the world. At the same time, it's said that whoever marries the spirit of the age becomes a widow tomorrow. So if we continue to keep changing according to public opinion, then we again sell out. So how do we navigate that? Again, to me, it seems that what happens in a community is we get individuals who are on maybe both sides of the scale. And that's where I'm talking about why healthy dialogue then helps them to actually balance each other and actually come to hopefully the golden mean. I remember one teacher explained it, that there are two sides to the arrow, the bow, sorry. And although they seem to be opposite, their opposition actually allows for a taut string, which then allows you to then powerfully shoot the arrow, So it seems as though the real thing is, how do we interface those and integrate those opinions, if that's at all possible.
Yeah. I think there's great opportunity for growth in even just trying, right?
Yeah.
Whether we succeed or not. So we have a question from Facebook, Lena Florio. Hare Krishna, how to support the distressed neophyte? How can these vulnerabilities be utilized in forming transformative spiritual awareness? So then, quite a unusual question in a way, but how to support the distressed neophyte? How can these vulnerabilities be utilized in forming transformative spiritual awareness? I don't know if you can make something of that.
Yeah, I guess, well, when you say the distressed neophyte, I think maybe what you're referring to is that someone who you can't necessarily just try to bring them out of their distress by talking about philosophy or giving some high principle, someone who's not ready to digest that yet in order to come out of their kind of turmoil. How do we continue to help them? Well, of course, the first and foremost thing is friendship, kindness. Oftentimes, it's not even about giving answers or giving empowering messages. In the beginning, sometimes it's just about presence and attention and time and just being there. And again, that human aspect, humanity and transcendence. Often we think that helping someone in their distress means to always give the transcendental perspective. But sometimes helping someone in their distress can also mean just to give the human kindness and just to be there. That can often go a long way. So I would suggest that we don't underestimate that. We know that Arjuna heard the whole Bhagavad Gita, and then later on, when Abhimanyu was surrounded by the Kaurava phalanx and killed, and Arjuna went to that place, then in the Mahabharata it's described that Arjuna was crying, tears of grief. And at that time, Krishna didn't give him any transcendental knowledge. Krishna just stayed with him in that grief. So I would suggest that that's really, really important. And then what I would say is that gradually it's about trying to show individuals how in the uncomfortable situations that arise in the world, many gifts come about that we can't necessarily see in the moment. The pain that we go to is often deepening our wisdom. The pain that we go through is often opening the door to new opportunities. The pain that we go through is sometimes imperceptibly strengthening our resolve. And in this way, when we look closely, we can see that all the uncomfortable situations of the world ultimately prepare us for something better. And it's just about trying to give that empowering message, but for that empowering message to really penetrate the heart, there has to be relationship. Yeah.
That's a brilliant answer. I've always found, I think you're growing into it even more and more, like you to be a great example of humanity and transcendence, because even that point about friendship, it's sort of such a powerful but kind of non-obvious answer in a way. I one devotee shared it yesterday. Kendra, he shared this thing on Facebook. Apparently Viktor Frankl, who wrote the Man's Search for Meaning, wrote the book. He was sharing a story that Viktor Frankl, I don't know how the circumstances were, maybe he was volunteering or something, but this woman rang him up in the middle of the night and said she was going to kill herself. And he stayed up for hours talking to her, and he gave her all these, he listened, he gave her all these great reasons why she shouldn't do it. And then she didn't kill herself, and he had opportunity to speak to her later, and he said, well, what reason was it that I gave you that you didn't do it? She said, none of the reasons were the reason. It was just the fact that there was a person in the world that would stay up in the middle of the night listening to me that gave me faith enough that this world, it was worth living, you know. And it was, it's such a, so important, isn't it? Often underestimated friendship and relationships and stuff.
Yeah, and just you mentioned Viktor Frankl, and just on this point of turmoil and difficulty and how to give, he mentions in his book, he says that the last human freedom is the freedom to be enthusiastic about life. He says everything can be taken away from someone, but when the enthusiasm for life has been taken away from them, then that signifies death. And he said, so he was talking about how many in the concentration camp lost that hunger for life, and therefore, but he managed to preserve it. And I think that's really, you know, what I try to share with people who are going through difficult situations, perhaps the loss of a loved one or something like that. I try to share with them that life will never be the same. That's true, but life can still be beautiful. And that's really the message, to not deny their pain, to not deny their loss, to not deny the discomfort, but then to empower them with a vision of what lies beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I had one last question I wanted to ask you. It was really interesting to hear those two verses that are quoted twice in the Bhagavad Gita. I thought that was really interesting. I didn't know that, and but particularly that one about prescribed duty. So what I was thinking was, what does it mean, prescribed duty? Because you know, we hear a lot now about this kind of narrative that like circumstances and, you know, your family's expectations or your belief of what you're possible to do will mean, oh, I'm destined to just be like whatever, a carpenter or an accountant or whatever it is. Like, that's my prescribed duty. But then someone else can turn around and go, no, it's not. That's just because you just think that you're just seeing it like that. Actually, you could do something so much different than that, or maybe better than that, or whatever, you know. So in a sort of a caste type system, it's easy to sort of understand. Someone will tell you this is your prescribed duty, or even, you know, your inclination to some extent. But what about this so how do we understand prescribed duty? Because prescribed sounds like it's something very specific and definite, whereas actually another way of looking at it is it could be wide open what we could do.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ravi, for raising this. I just did something, actually. I was just in Switzerland. I'll share it with you because it kind of relates to this. If you just see this, that when we think of Dharma, we often think of it as like, generally we're thinking of it as occupation, which is definitely true because, you know, they say our occupation takes 80,000 hours of our life. So our Varna Dharma, and as you said, that aspect of, you know, am I a carpenter, or someone else tells me I'm something else. I think we find our Dharma by doing internal introspection and also by hearing from people, but those people have to know us, they have to love us, they have to have spiritual vision. Otherwise, if you just end up listening from everyone has an opinion. So Dharma means, I guess, finding your Varna Dharma is a mix of both. We often tell people, analyze yourself, ask others, and attempt different things. And through that process, you find your Dharma. But then Dharma doesn't just mean your Varna Dharma. You also have an ashram Dharma, you know, like you're in a certain life stage, you know. People come to Krishna consciousness and often they've already created a set of material responsibilities and a certain life situation, and that has to be honored. You can't just eject yourself from that because now you're on a different journey and you have to find a way to integrate. And then there's upper Dharma, which means almost like emergency situations. So different Dharmas come in at different times in our life, which you know, just have to be attended to. Samanya Dharma means like universal moral qualities. In the 7th canto, it's called qualities of civilized human beings that we all have to cultivate. So like this, and then ultimately all of this should then feed into Sanatan Dharma, because the Bhagavatam says that if you do all of your dharmas perfectly, but it doesn't lead to attraction for the Supreme Lord, then it's a waste of time. And so how to then ultimately integrate that Dharma. So I think Dharma and understanding what is our Dharma is kind of like a complex network of different things. And I think in our communities now, we tend to be talking about Dharma more. I mean, I don't think it was, I first became kind of involved properly about 25 years ago, and I didn't hear so much about Dharma then, but now I think we're realizing that understanding what those prescribed duties are in a very, in a very authentic way is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Maharaj. Lena over on Facebook also, she said thank you. Thank you, Maharaj. Fantastic. I think unless you have any more points to finish us up on, Maharaj, I think we'll start.
I think we made some progress today and some points came out there, and yeah, I hope it will help us to think a little bit deeper about this, how to find that humanity in transcendence through these three aspects, and just really appreciate everyone's input. And
no, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who's watching right now and who will watch later. We appreciate. Hopefully, there's, well, no doubt, because there was a very structured presentation. Thank you. That there'll be points and takeaways for you personally, but do try to share them with other people and maybe have some conversations with your friends and get into these topics and unpack them. And yeah, I'd like to thank you, Maharaj. It's where are we? It's just after midnight. So, and I know you've been traveling a lot. Genuinely appreciate you. I appreciate you being here. I do, but actually more broadly than that, I know I keep saying it, but I just mean it because I don't see it as often as maybe it would be. You know, you're like a fresh generation, and you have that. I really believe you have that humanity, and at the same time, you're very serious on the path. So, a great combination. Thank you.